We end the year with the government saying it has a solution to at least reduce higher prices next year for gas and electricity as well. We have the gas industry furious, the opposition sceptical, and endless amounts of commentary suggesting all things in between. So where does this all lie? Joining me live is Director of the Grattan Institute's Energy Program, Tony Wood. Thanks very much for your time. We said we'd speak again once the dust has settled. It has, or it's still being churned up, if I can continue the analogy a bit longer. Let's start with whether this will do what the government says it will do, take the edge off higher prices. They were going to increase a lot, now they're just going to increase quite a bit, essentially. Is that what's going to happen?
Like, Tom, that's about the best we can see through the cloud of dust you've just been talking about. There's so many moving pieces that I think most of the agencies who are responsible for the market and certainly the government need to be very cautious, and they are being very cautious about any projections about where prices are going to be, because there's going to be a very interesting year. Some of the things the government has done, I think, are absolutely the right ones, but there's so many external pressures, including how does the war in the Ukraine play out for energy in a geopolitical sense is very difficult. There are a whole lot of domestic things also stacking up, which have been kicked down the road for a while and have been a little bit put to one side because of this fight over gas prices and coal prices. So there's a lot of moving bits, and I think the government at least will feel that they'll just stagger across the line with at least a win.
Yeah, and we'll get to those in a moment. The short term, I guess, with the government is on these price caps and whether they'll work. What part of the government's argue has been, if you look at the history of price of gas, for example, in Australia, domestically, it's been well below the $12 cap, i.e. what's happening now is all about the war in Ukraine and partly, I suppose, a bit of COVID and supply chain issues. So how accurate is that? Because the flip side is in terms of investment, whether we lose it, yes, $12 is a great profitable price if you're talking about gas in Australia, but if you're talking about new investment, is a company deciding between Australia with that price cap and anywhere else where they think we might have a few years of bumper profits or bumper profits again in 10 years? Is that where investment could dry up?
Well, I think there's a great uncertainty. I think in the short term, that is the next 12 months, the government has pretty well got it about right. Put the $12 price cap in. I think it's a reasonable number. It most likely will bring down prices higher than they otherwise would have been, because even though it's a relatively small amount of gas involved, it does have a big impact on electricity prices, because gas often sets the price in the market. So I think that will work. It'll be hard to tell because, as you said, Tom, we're going to see prices probably going up a bit next year, but not as much as they would have done. And some people will feel, well, I still got hit in the face even if it wasn't quite as bad as it might have been. And then, of course, there's the questions, well, the second part of what the government's announced, which is the bit that's really got the industry in a bit of a tiz over this, with some justification. But of course, in the short term, the Prime Minister has got the political wind in his sail. So they've got to sit down and think about how they're going to turn the debate away from the lost conversation about immediate price caps and turn the debate towards what happens next. And that's an issue for both the government and the industry, because we are going to need gas for a while yet, even though we know in the longer term we're not going to need gas. So that's the challenge, right?
Yeah, to make sure we have it in the short term, and then all the other elements of the grid, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I guess the final element just on gas, you mentioned what happens beyond the 12 months. This is the so-called reasonable price test, which we're yet to get full detail of. But it does strike me, what we have already in effect with the trigger is a gas reservation policy. I mean, nobody seriously thinks we'll run out of domestic gas as it's continued to be exported at these huge numbers. I mean, feel free to correct me if you'd like to on that. So is the counter-argument to whether these gas companies suddenly reduce investment in Australia is what they'd actually reduce ultimately is how much they're exporting, and that's the stuff they're making a lot of money on. So is it a bluff that Labor's right to call in that regard?
Well, it is, as you say, quite complicated. There are several moving pieces here. In the broader sense, I think what you described is correct. And the government and the companies will want to maintain the security of supply that they provide to overseas customers. They will want to take advantage of overseas high prices while they can. But in the domestic sense, we're not about to run out of gas, broadly speaking. The challenge is that next year, or more likely the year after, depends on the weather, we may very well find ourselves very tight, if not short of gas in Victoria next year or the year after. And none of the things we're talking about would deliver gas so far in the timescale available. So that's where the focus is going to be. And that's where some of the companies have said, well, we may not look for more gas in Victoria. Well, even if they found it tomorrow, the chances of getting into the system next year are pretty slim. So there's a very strong tension here. And who's going to win on the political game here, I think, is uncertain. Right now, the government is, but there will be. It is important that this longer-term issue of some form of ongoing effective price control, in my view, needs to be resolved. And I don't think either side have absolutely got it right, even though in the short term, the Prime Minister almost certainly has.
Yeah, so Victoria is, as you say, a particular issue. Does it end up being a pipeline? Is Narrabri maybe online within 2 and a bit years? All questions we're yet to answer. And then there's Beetaloo, of course, whether that's somehow pipeline to the east. Are we doing shipments? Anyway, all those to be decided. The longer term that you're talking about, that's almost been put off because of the short-term crisis, is the challenges that remain. We're seeing coal shut down. That's clearly happening. Gas ultimately will one day start reducing from the grid as well. How well prepared are we for all of that? Because there's also building a totally new grid for renewables, and we it's a wait and see on how good battery technology will get over the next 10 or 15 years.
Look, I think that's the big question now for the government. There are 3 or 4 issues, not many of them, but they're all very significant. And to some extent, they've been kicked down the road for the last 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years, and not solved. And what we're doing now is we've jammed up things very tightly because the government has legislated an emissions reduction target. It has a more ambitious renewables energy target for 2030. And before the end of this term, it will set a 2035 target for our international commitments as well. Now, what that means is that if we are going to accelerate as fast as that, the stuff we've got to build to be able to achieve high levels of solar and wind, that's what renewables will be mostly, and maintain reliability, is very challenging. We have to build a lot of transmission, many gigawatts of new generation of solar and wind, and as you say, storage, whether that's pumped hydro for the longer term, and even that won't be enough, and batteries as well. Now, how that all fits together is a really big issue. What we don't want to see, in my view, is fragmentation where the states in frustration do it themselves. So far, they seem to be trying to work with the federal government. The federal government does, therefore, I think, have a leadership role, but all the states don't trust governments, federal governments, all the time. So now's the time, while that trust is still there, to bring those various elements together into a comprehensive and cohesive plan that actually makes sense so that we can get on with building what is going to be an enormous transformation over what is now 8 years or so. And that is a very significant challenge.
Otherwise, we start talking about the next crisis. Tony Wood, great to get your thoughts. Enjoy the break. I'm sure you'll be in demand again as we figure out what these caps will mean in 2023. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.